All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see everybody, and I think everybody's in a good mood. I think a little bit better because we, unlike last Sunday where we got some very disturbing news, we have everybody back with us, and life is good. It's starting to look like spring. I don't know, I don't know about you, but I'm starting to see bluebonnets on the roadway, and everything in my neighborhood's starting to bud out. So it wasn't there last Sunday. Now it is. It's like somebody flipped a switch and it's a little drier. Yeah, so it's probably taking its time. Oh yeah, and yes, absolutely. Because some spots are getting rain, but not everywhere, and it's really critical out in the hill country, out where James and Dawn are living, and that's where we need the rain because that's also where we get where Austin's water source comes from. So we need to make sure that those lakes are filled, or reasonably full anyway. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew. If you want to turn to chapter 26, and every now and then when you teach class, you finish your class, and then about 30 minutes later, it hits you like, oh, maybe I should have said this. So it's one of those moments where I'm going to just make a comment that finishes up or touches on what we were talking about last week. It has to do with the parable that Jesus taught about the sheep and the goats and why that division takes place. And especially with the goats, the people on the left that are sent off to eternal punishment, and they say, "Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison? We don't recall that." And he said, "Well, whenever you didn't do anything like that for the least of my people, you didn't do it for me." And so, they go off to an unhappy end. And a little bit later, it dawned on me there was a saying that somebody, not necessarily Christian, but he said, a lot of folks think that the opposite of love is like hate or anger, and it really isn't. The opposite of love is apathy, not caring. And I think maybe that's where some of us may kind of get into trouble with the Lord. Just kind of, especially when we're confronted with situations with folks who are poor or sick or in some other way needy, and we just kind of turn a blind eye, and it's not, maybe in a couple of cases or very few cases, our response may be predicated on angry feelings or hatefulness or whatever, but and that may be true of some other people as well, but more often than not, it basically just has to do with we don't give a darn. Think about the parable of the rich fool. It's not in Matthew, but it's in Luke, and where Jesus tells about this guy. Life is good. He's rich. He's everything has gone his way, is coming his way, and his number one priority, and as it turns out, his only priority is to tear down his barns and build bigger barns so he can keep everything. Never a thought, apparently, to, hey, Lord's really blessed me here. I could share some of that with some folks. And then, of course, the Lord basically sends him a memo that says, you're not going to be able to enjoy this because within 24 hours you're not going to be alive. And who will get your stuff then? So food for thought, especially as the Lord puts people in our lives. What should our response be? And food for thought. But anyway, and where we are now in Matthew's story as we get into chapter 26. Basically, Jesus has done with his public appearances and his ministry. He's left the temple area. He's left Jerusalem. He's been last week we saw him teaching some things to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, which are just outside the city. And it's interesting. If you were watching a movie of this story, this could not be better situated than like a movie, where Matthew opens up with two scenes. First scene is we're still with Jesus and his disciples, and Matthew says when Jesus had finished saying all these things, the things that we talked about and read last Sunday, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away." The Passover is the reason why it seems like everybody, well, at least all the good religious Jews are in Jerusalem right now. The Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. A reminder one more time of what's going to happen. So we have that scene, and then Matthew shifts the scene over into verse 3. He says, "Then the chief priests and the elders of the people, they're having a meeting of their own. They assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas." Caiaphas is a guy that technically should not be the high priest. On a religious level, if you were following the way God had set things up, the real high priest would have been his father-in-law, Ananias. But keep in mind, these are the days of the Roman Empire, and who you are is largely determined by what the Romans think of you and will allow you to do, and so forth. And for whatever reason, Ananias has fallen out of favor with the Romans, but Caiaphas has somewhere along the line struck a deal. So at least technically, if not officially, he is now the chief priest, because basically the Romans have said, we'll put you in charge of the Jewish folks, and as long as you keep everybody in line, we'll be happy with you. So they meet at the palace of Caiaphas. They call it a palace, so he must, being high priest, must come with some nice little perks. And during that meeting, verse 4, they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him, but not during the festival, not during the feast of what's going on, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. So the plan is, by hook or by crook, get Jesus off secretly, squirrel him off, and put him to death. We've had enough of this Jesus. He has rocked our boats one too many times, and we didn't like the way things went on the public confrontations of the temple. We're finally going to do something about this guy and be done with him. So that is going on. And of course, that if you read this casually, you may think, oh, gee, things are spinning out of control for Jesus. No, this is basically, keep in mind, whatever's going on, God's in control. The reason that the priests are able to scheme to put Jesus to death is because God's allowing it to happen. It's all part of the great plan. So the story continues, verse 6. Jesus continues he moves out from the Mount of Olives, goes into one of the nearby cities, Bethany, and he's in the home of Simon the leper. Maybe his exact title should be Simon the former leper, because if he was still a leper, there ain't no way he was going to be able to do anything, much less host a dinner at his house. Because, as you know, lepers, or leprosy being an incurable disease, those folks were condemned to a life of isolation and loneliness. In fact, they had to make sure that they were, we've seen in episodes we've had our experiences with social distancing. Lepers really had to practice social distancing, stay away from other people so they wouldn't infect them. But Simon apparently has been healed, but everybody remembers what he used to be, so the name tag sticks. Hello, my name is Simon the leper. Probably wears his name tag, whatever. But hey, he's got a new life, thanks to Jesus. So they're having a dinner in his house, and during this dinner, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which he poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. Uh, for some reason, Matthew chooses not to identify this woman, but over in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, we learn that it's Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. And they're very good friends of Jesus. In fact, Lazarus has an interesting story of his own, having been raised from the dead by Jesus. And keep in mind also the way during the culture and, of course, the furnishings of the typical house at the time, when you were having dinner with someone, you didn't sit at the table. There were no chairs. The table was very low situated, so that when you were eating, you were actually lying on your side. That's why Jesus is defined or pictured as reclining at the table, as were everybody else who was dining. So Mary, or this unknown woman, comes and takes this container of very expensive perfume, something that's very rare, something that you just don't casually buy because it's so expensive, breaks it open, pours it on his head. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Just a couple of comments about the statement that Jesus made about the poor you'll always have with you. He may actually be quoting from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 11. Take a look at that verse. It's easy also to see Jesus saying that and then taking that statement to mean that Jesus doesn't care about the poor, and neither should we. It shouldn't be interpreted that way. That's basically, if you read that interpretation that way, you're reading it out of context, especially when Jesus had this teaching about the need to be open and sensitive to the needs of other people. Basically, he's just stating a fact of life. Especially one that an economy, a world that's been hit by sin, affected by sin, will continue to until Jesus returns. Basically, someone is always going to be poor. Even in what you think might be a perfect society, there's always going to be someone who will be the short end of something in some regard. So on the one hand, do we need to be sensitive to that, help people where we can? Of course, yes, continue to do that. But on the other hand, he's telling the disciples, hey, chill out a little bit. You know, what Mary is doing here is significant. It's not a waste of perfume or of money or whatever. This is very significant. This is very important. It matters. It relates to this whole situation that I've been warning you about and trying to prepare you for. So he says she's done a beautiful thing, and she's preparing me for my burial when this what will be the crucifixion happens to me. Well, for whatever reason, maybe it's this, maybe it's for some other reason, maybe it's for several reasons. Verse 14, Judas apparently has had enough. Judas, one of the apostles, one of the 12, Matthew says, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" It's kind of like the quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys going over to the management over at the Washington football team and saying, hey, how'd you like to have our playbook? Only it's, of course, much more serious. He says, hey, I'm happy to tell you where Jesus is. If you're looking for him, I'm happy to deliver him to you for a price. What are you willing to give me? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. Interesting. I don't know how they came up with 30 pieces. Now, apparently, maybe they were just going by the economy, the current day economy, which was if you wanted to buy or sell a slave, your basic slave, nothing special to him, maybe just a very young man starting out on the road to slavery, hey, $25, or the equivalent of what 30 pieces of silver would be. Yeah, we can give you what we would pay for a slave if you were selling him to us. Unknowingly, they are unwittingly fulfilling some Old Testament scripture, because 30 pieces is apparently mentioned in Exodus chapter 21, verse 31, mentioned again in Joel chapter 3. About 30 pieces of silver was paid for me. So anyway, they count out 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Yeah, I'll figure out where he's going, where he's going to stay, and if he's going to stay long enough, and I'll come and get you boys. Lots of speculation in commentaries. Why did Judas do this? Here he is. He's one of the 12 disciples. He's in the inner circle. He's obviously, Jesus trusts him, from a human perspective. Judas is in a sweet spot, and yet he sells him out. Why would he do this? And so some commentators have kind of speculated that, maybe he figured he deserved a higher position of leadership among the apostles. Everybody's listening to Peter and James and John. Nobody listens to me. And that really, that really makes me angry. I should be higher in the hierarchy. I should be, at least, if I'm not president of the apostles, I should be vice president at least. But will they do it? No. Maybe he was disillusioned with Jesus. Maybe he figured, hey, if he is the Messiah, he should be calling down all sorts of forces, kicking out the Romans. He should be installing himself. He should have installed himself as king by now. And here he is. He's teaching and preaching all this other stuff that has nothing to do with political power. Maybe he thought that, hey, I really am with Jesus. I really want to support what I think he's trying to do, but he's just going about it the wrong way, or he's moving too slowly. Maybe if I set up this confrontation, I can force his hand, and he'll do what I think he ought to do. That could have been one of those reasons, could have been any or all of the above. We don't know. All we know is there was an element of greed, because he offered to give up Jesus, and he asked for money. What will you give me if I hand him over to you? 30 pieces of silver. $25. Maybe $25 was a lot of money back in the day. Not much today. And all things considered, even back then, $25 was pretty cheap for what Judas was handing over. Something to think about. One other thing about Judas and his character. John notes in his gospel that he was a thief. They put him in charge of what they call the treasury, which was basically managing the disciples' funds. And they figured out, apparently, at some point, that Judas was helping himself to the funds for himself. So greed was definitely a factor. It's really the only one that we know of. But the story continues in verse 17. On the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, one of the things that is associated with Passover, The disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He replied, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, 'The teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover. You may recall that getting ready for the Passover was not just a casual thing of, okay, let's just get a couple of extra spaces at the table. You had to go through this ritualistic cleaning so that wherever you were having the Passover was clean and acceptable from a religious point of view. That included cleaning out, getting rid of all the yeast in the kitchen, among other things. It could not, your place of meeting for the Passover could not be unclean. So a lot of work that went into preparing for the Passover dinner. Verse 20. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And somewhere along the lines, in John, we've had the episode where Jesus washes their feet. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?" Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." A little scary. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Nice act, Judas. I'm sure everyone was convinced. Jesus answered, "You've said so. Yes, it is you." You said it, Judas. I didn't. Interestingly enough, John says that even with this conversation going on, nobody at that time thought that Judas was being ID'd or fingered as the betrayer. They figured that this was the end of a conversation Jesus might have had with Judas in terms of making some preparations and not necessarily anything to sell him out. It's also interesting that when John says that as soon as Judas took the piece of bread Jesus offered him, Satan entered into him. And then Jesus said, "What you're about to do quickly." And that was the part of the conversation the disciples didn't understand. Or at least they wouldn't understand it until much later. So apparently at that point, he leaves. But in verse 26, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." This starts out, and essentially it is the Passover supper. But what are we seeing here? Jesus is instituting what we call the Lord's Supper, what we call communion. He's taking the Passover supper, something that basically began with a historic event, which was when the Israelites were freed from Egypt. And of course, we know what happened there. They took a lamb, and from the blood of that lamb, they painted the door frames with the blood of their lamb. And when the angel of death came over, if you saw the blood, they were spared. If not, then the firstborn in that household died. And of course, the Israelites that complied with that, they were saved. The Egyptians who didn't, not so fortunate. Of course, that little episode not only was based on history, but it also looked forward to a coming moment. And of course, that moment is now. Jesus takes what has been a religious tradition, an historic tradition, and basically he brings it to full completion, because he is now sacrificial lamb. He's the one who's offering himself once and for all for the salvation of his people. So he takes the bread, gives thanks, he breaks it, gives it to the disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. For I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung of him, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Interesting. You wonder, what hymn did they sing? Some think that it might have been the collection of psalms that were typically sung at the end of the Passover meal, perhaps, they think. That's called the Hallel, and it includes Psalms 116 through 118. You might want to go back and read those psalms. Some of the things that are said in those three psalms have great import at this point in time. There's a lot of other things that Jesus has with his disciples that are covered in the Gospel of John and that you can also read about. But at this point in Matthew's account, verse 31, Jesus tells the disciples, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I've risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Well, one more time, one more reminder, one more warning about what's about to happen. When it happens, guys, don't be shocked, is what Jesus is trying to tell him. And even down to the point that when it happens, you're going to do something that is very shocking to you. But I know it's going to happen, but, don't let it get you down. Well, Peter, and we know how Peter can just say what he thinks is the right thing at the right time. One of those moments here, Peter replies, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." Jesus has a response for him in verse 34. "Truly, I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." Interestingly enough, apparently in that portion of Palestine, we're used to hearing about how the rooster crows at dawn. Apparently in that region, or at least in that custom at the time, the roosters were known for crowing somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m. In fact, the Romans had a word for that time of night. They called it the cock-crow time. So that might be an indication as to a time frame when what we're about to see happen. But he says, "Peter, don't count on your strength here. If you do, something embarrassing, something awful is going to happen to you." He says, "This very night, before you see the dawn of day, the exact opposite thing that you're telling me will never happen is going to happen. You're going to deny me." Peter doesn't buy it. He says, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. So all of the disciples are on record as saying, "Hey, we're with you. We're with you to the bitter end. We'll fight for you. We'll even die for you. You have nothing to worry about." Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." Interestingly enough, the name Gethsemane basically means olive press. The location is in a grove of olive trees. It's a site where the olives were collected and then they were crushed to get their oil. Very symbolic, because Jesus is about to encounter something very, very crushing. So he takes Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, that would be James and John, the sons of thunder. He takes them along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Very human response, knowing what's about to happen. This is the human side of Jesus praying. Gee, if there's any other way, Father, take this awful thing from me. But yet not as I will, but as you will. Yes, Father, it is awful, truly awful, worse than I can bear. But if this is what you need me to do, I'm going to do it. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Probably not a bad response. It's late in the night. They've had a full meal. They're exhausted physically and probably emotionally and mentally, because one more time they're being told something bad's about to happen. That stresses you out. What do a lot of us do when we're really, really, really stressed out at the end of a long day? We fall asleep. We can't help it. Our systems just shut down. But Jesus says, couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. Yes, one of the Psalms refers to a punishment or judgment from God as basically a big cup of wine that, hey, you're going to drink this. And Jesus may have been referring to that kind of imagery here, this cup. Obviously, again, his human side, if there's any other way of doing this, doing what you want me to do, that would very much appeal to me. But this is the only way to do it. I'm going to do it. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. And while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. Apparently, once he left the group, he went straight to the chief priest, the officials, said, I know where Jesus is. Let's go get him. And so the chief priest basically sends him back with this mob. This would be, basically there was what they called a temple guard. These were folks designated by the religious officials, and maybe even some soldiers. Because after all, the Romans want to keep their hands on everything that's related to law and order, and maybe some rabble rousers as well. Hey, the larger the mob, the better. That way, it's insurance that Jesus doesn't get away. So a large crowd with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Probably so because, hey, it's going to be dark. The lighting's not going to be all that good. And, some of you guys may not even know what he looks like. And we don't want to wind up arresting and beating up on the wrong man, right? So I'll just give this very clear signal. The guy I kiss is the guy you need to grab hold of. So he sees Jesus. Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus replied, and very interesting, depending on what translation you're reading, Jesus says to him, why have you come, friend? Other translations say, do what you came for, friend. Interesting, and regardless of the translation, Jesus refers to Judas as friend. So his love for Judas hasn't changed. His attitude toward Judas hasn't changed. He's still a friend. You kind of get the sense that Jesus is offering every opportunity possible to regardless of what he may have done before or said before, I'm still offering you an opening. Step aside. The Lord's will be done. It just won't, it'll be done some other way, and you won't have to suffer the consequences. But Judas goes through with it anyway. Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions, interestingly, Matthew leaves him nameless, but John, again, IDs the guy, it's Peter. One of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Pretty powerful source. If you wonder what Jesus is referring to, if we were just looking at the Roman way of organizing their military forces, what would 12 legions of soldiers be? Well, that would total something like 72,000 foot soldiers and 8,400 horse soldiers. A very formidable force. But basically all that Jesus would have needed would have been one angel, because there's at least one story in the Old Testament where one angel just by himself killed up to 185,000 soldiers. That's in 2 Kings. These guys don't know what they're dealing with or who they're dealing with. Jesus basically just could have snapped his fingers and it would have been total disaster to them. But that's not what Jesus did. It's not what he's doing here. He says, how then, if I were to call up aid to deliver myself, how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? And at that time, Jesus said to the crowd, am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching. The basic posture of any kind of Jewish teacher. Basically, they sat. They didn't stand or anything. They sat down. People surrounded them. And here I was sitting in the temple courts teaching. You had ample opportunity to grab hold of me, and you didn't do it. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then, contrary to what everybody said, and true to what Jesus said in verse 31, just a few verses earlier, all the disciples deserted him, including Peter, and fled. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled, including the Sanhedrin, which, by the way, this is an illegal meeting because according to the laws that were set up at the time, Sanhedrin was not supposed to meet at night. But they're meeting at night anyway. They are so set on doing what they want to do to Jesus that they're willing to break their own laws. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Well, Jesus kind of sort of said something like that, and that's recorded in John chapter 2, verse 19. But, of course, it's taken out of context. Jesus was not talking about getting some dynamite and blowing up the Jerusalem temple. He was speaking of the temple of his body. But in a kangaroo court like this, who cares about the truth? We just want a reasonable approximation of it. This is what there's a late night talk show guy that talks about something that has truthiness to it as opposed to it being true. This had truthiness to it. Then the high priest, and it's interesting here from this point on, Matthew doesn't refer to Caiaphas by name. I find that interesting. Just to the title. The high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, if you are the Messiah, the Son of God, tell us." Jesus replied, "It is as you said. You've said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "High priest, anytime you see a religious official tearing their clothes, it's a sign of deep distress, some deep offense against God." Yeah. High priest is demonstrating what he thinks. We finally caught him. He's finally done the one thing we've been wanting to accuse him of. He's spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you've heard the blasphemy. He's making himself equal with God. He's calling himself the Son of God. What do you think? "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face, struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us." Basically, assuming he was blindfolded here, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?" As bad as all that is going on, the worst is yet to come. It's Jesus physically. So we're going to stop there. We'll finish up on chapter 26, get into chapter 27 next Sunday. I hope you enjoyed our lesson today, got something out of it. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you here next Sunday. Thanks a lot.